Chapter 9. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 9. Commander-in-Chief. The deeds done ere this by the King's troops had made a great stir throughout the land. The chief men of each state met in Philadelphia and sought out ways and means to help those who were in arms, as foes of King George, and a large force of men from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia were soon on hand to march and join the troops near Boston. But who was to lead them? The choice at once fell on George Washington, but he held back. He thought that Massachusetts troops might not care to be led by a man from the South, and General Ward, who was then at their head, had the first right, for Washington's rank was not so high as his. There was much talk on this score, and in the midst of it, a Massachusetts man, John Adams, rose and said that the man he thought fit to lead our troops was in that room, and he came from Virginia. All knew who he meant, and as Washington heard his own name, he rose from his seat and left the room. Then votes were cast, and all were for Washington, and he felt that he could not say no to such a call. He spoke his thanks in a few words, and said that he would do the best that he could, and serve without pay. He set out from Philadelphia, June 21st, 1775. With him were General Lee and General Schuyler, and a troop of light horse, which went all the way to New York. As soon as it was known that Washington was on the road, crowds ran out to meet him and to show their pride in him. When he reached New York, he heard of the fight at Bunker Hill and made haste to join the troops in their camp at Cambridge. He reached there July 2nd. The next day, all the troops were drawn out in line, and Washington rode out at the head of his staff till he came to a large elm tree. Here he wheeled his horse and drew his sword and took charge of all our troops as their commander-in-chief. He found much to do and much to bear from his own men as well as from the redcoats. It came to his ears that our men who fell into the hands of the redcoats at Bunker's Hill were not well used, and he wrote at once to Gage and asked him to be less harsh. Gage, who had fought by his side in 1753, when both were young men, wrote back that he thought he should have praise and not blame, since he had saved the lives of those who were doomed to be hung. Washington at first thought he would do as he was done by, but his heart failed him. And those of the redcoats that were in the hands of our troops were set free. If they gave their word, they would not fight for King George. By such acts, Washington sought to show that Americans are as merciful as they are brave. The camps in which Washington found his troops were as odd as the men themselves. Some of the tents were made of boards, some of sailcloth, or bits of both, while here and there were those made of stone and turf, brick and brushwood. Some were thrown up in haste and bore no marks of care, while a few were wrought with wreaths and twigs, and spoke well for the taste of those who made them. The best camp of all was that of the Rhode Island men, in charge of General Nathaniel Greene. Here were found as good tents as the redcoats had, and the men were well drilled and well dressed. Greene was brought up on a farm. His father was a blacksmith, and at times his son worked with the plow or took his place at the forge. At the first note of war, Greene left the farm, and in the month of May 1775 was in charge of all the troops of his own small state. He went to Boston and took notes while there of all that the redcoats did, and in this way he learned much that he could put to good use. His troops had fought at Bunker Hill, and there were none in the whole force that bore themselves so well or made so fine a show. Greene was 6 feet tall, and not quite 20 years of age. He was strong and well built, and his frank way won the heart of Washington, and the two were warm friends from that time. Washington now set to work to add strength to the weak parts of his line, and to throw up fresh works round the main forts. All the livestock had to be kept off the coast so they would not fall into the hands of the foe. He sought to draw the redcoats out of Boston, but they would not stir. When Washington took charge of his troops, he thought he could go back to his home when the cold days came on and spend some time there with his wife. But there was no chance for him to leave. So he wrote to Mrs. Washington to join him in the camp. She came and stayed with him till the next spring, and this was her course all through the war. She came in her own coach and four, with her son and his wife. The black footmen were dressed in red and white, and the whole turnout was in the style in use in Virginia at that day. Washington had his rooms in the Craig House in Cambridge, and here Mrs. Washington took charge and gave the place more of a home-like air. At that time, the camp of Cambridge was filled with all sorts of troops. Some had spent most of their lives in boats, some were brought up on farms, some came from the woods, and each group wore the dress that pleased them best, and laughed at those who were not dressed the same. This made sport for some time, and jokes flew thick and fast. One day some men came into camp dressed in an odd garb, such as was worn to hunt in. The suit was made of deerskin, and the long shirt had a deep fringe all round. This dress was the cause of much mirth to men who came from the seashore, and were used to short coats and rough plain clothes. There was snow on the ground, and when the jokes gave out, snowballs took their place, for a war of words is quite sure to end in blows. Men came up to the aid of both sides, fists were used, and all took part in the hand-to-hand fight, and there was a great stir in the camp. While the fight was at its height, Washington rode up. None of his aides were with him. He threw the reins of his own horse into the hands of the black men who rode near, sprang from his seat, and rushed into the thick of the fray. Then he seized two of the tall, stout huntsmen by the throat, and talked to them and shook them while he held them at arm's length. This put an end to the brawl at once, and the rest of the crowd slunk off in haste, and left but 3 men on the ground, Washington and the 2 he held in his grasp. As the cold days and nights came on, the men grew homesick, and longed to be by their own firesides. It was right that some of them should go, for they had served out their time, and this made the rest lonesome and sad. Songs would not cheer them, and they paid no heed to the words of those who sought to rouse them from the depths of woe. Washington was full of fears, which were shared by all those who were near him in rank, yet he did not lose hope. General Greene wrote, "They seem to be so sick of this way of life, and so homesick, that I fear a large part of our troops will soon go home." Still his heart did not lose hope. All would come right in time, and his words of cheer were a great help to Washington at this time. The year 1775 had been a dark one for our land, and there was no ray of hope to light the dawn of 1776. There were but 10,000 troops to take the field. There was a lack of arms, a lack of clothes, and a lack of food, and these things made camp life hard to bear and were a great grief to the heart of the chief. He could not sleep. Had the foe known of their plight, they would have borne down on them and swept them out of sight. But God took care of them. In the first month of the year, there was a stir on the Boston wharves. A large fleet of boats lay in the stream, on board of which the redcoats swarmed, and there were 2 sloops of war filled with guns and warlike stores. All were in charge of General Howe, and Washington guessed what his plans were, and felt that the time had come for him to strive to wrest Boston from the king's troops. The outlook was bright. More troops had come to his aid, and he made up his mind to place part of his force on Dorchester Heights, and if he could, draw out the foe to fight at that place. At a sign, the troops on the heights and at Nook's Hill were to fire at the same time, and rake the town with balls and bombshells. At the same time, boats full of troops were to start from the mouth of the Charles River and act in the rear of the redcoats. It was thought that these moves on the part of our troops would bring on such a fight as they had on Breed's Hill. On the night of March 4th, our men made their way to the heights, and at dawn of the next day, strong forts loomed up, and seemed as if they must have been brought there at the touch of a wand. Howe gazed on them and said, "The rebels have done more work in one night than my whole army would have done in a month." He must drive them from the heights or leave Boston. While pride urged him on, fear held him back, for he knew that his loss would be great. But he must make a move of some sort. So he made up his mind to send boats out that night with a force of troops in charge of Lord Percy. But a storm came up from the east. The surf beat high on the shore where the boats were to have land, and the scheme was put off till the next day. But it stormed just as hard the next day. The rain came down in sheets, and the boats stayed where they were. In the meantime, our men kept at work on the hills on the north side and south side. And when the storm ceased, General Howe saw that the forts were now so strong there would be no chance to take them. Nor was it safe for him to stay in Boston. Yet the admiral said that if Howe's troops did not seize the heights, the ships of war should not stay near Boston. So his lordship would have to leave with what grace he could, such as it might wound his pride. When word went forth that the troops were to leave, strange sights were seen in Boston town and bay. For some days the redcoats went this way and that in great haste. More than 70 boats were cast loose for sea, with at least 12,000 men on board of them. While this stir took place, not a shot was sent from the heights. And it was well that this was so, as the redcoats had laid plans to set the town in a blaze if our troops fired one gun. The redcoats left Boston March 17th, and our troops in charge of Old Put, as the brave Putnam was called, marched into town in fine style. For some days the fleet lay off the coast of Rhode Island, and it was feared for a while that they meant to strike a blow and win back what they had lost. But no such thing took place, and ere long the fleet sailed out of sight. "Where they are bound," wrote Washington, "and where they next will pitch their tents, I know not." He thought they were on their way to New York, but such was not the case. They had steered for Halifax to wait there for more troops, and for the large fleet that was to come from England. A vote of thanks and a large gold coin with his face on one side of it were sent to Washington by the chief men of the land as part of his due for what he had so far done to save America from King George's rule. Washington, who thought the next move of the redcoats would be on New York, set out for that place and reached there April 13th. He went to work at once to build forts and to send out troops, and to make the place as strong as it ought to be. He did not know the plans of the foe, nor from what point they would hurl the bolts of war. All was guesswork, but still in the midst of doubt, it would not do to be slack. The town was put in charge of the troops, and the rules were quite strict. Those who went in or out had to give the password. "We all live here, shut up like nuns," wrote one who was fond of a gay life. "There's no one in town that we can go to see, and none to come see us." Good times in New York were at an end. Our troops had been forced to leave Canada, and it was known that the redcoats would push their way to New York. Forts were built on high banks up the Hudson and on the isles at its mouth, and all done that could be done to check them in their march. In the meantime, it had been thought a good plan to set a day in which it might be shown throughout the land that America was, and of a right ought to be, a free land. So in July, an act was drawn up and signed by the wise men who met in Philadelphia to frame the laws for the new states. And there was great joy, for it was a great day. Bells were rung, shouts and cheers rent the air, fires blazed and hearts burned, and men knelt to pray and give thanks to God. John Adams said the 4th of July ought to be kept up with great pomp throughout America, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, and bonfires till the end of time. The news did not reach New York till July 9th, and at 6 o'clock that night Washington read the act to his troops. New York was wild with joy, and felt that more must be done than just to ring bells and light fires. In Bowling Green, in front of the fort, there stood a cast of George III, made of lead. This a mob of men pulled down and broke up, that the lead might be run into small shot and be used in the cause for which they fought. This did not please Washington, and he told his troops they must not take part in such deeds. The joy did not last long, for on July 12th, the ships of war in the bay sent out a broadside, and it was thought they would at once fire the town. Crowds were on the streets. The troops flocked to their posts. Fear was in each heart, and New York was in a great stir. But 2 ships, the Phoenix and the Rose, left the fleet and shaped their course up the Hudson. Then the guns were still, and fear died out for a while. That night there was a fresh scare. Guns boomed and clouds of smoke were seen near the ships of war down the bay. Men on the lookout told that a ship of the line had come in from sea, and each man of war gave her a round of guns as she passed by. At her foretop masthead she bore the flag of St. George. No need to tell more. "Lord Howe is come! Lord Howe is come!" was the cry that went from mouth to mouth, and the word soon flew through the town, and all felt that the hour of doom was close at hand. Lord Howe sought peace and not bloodshed, and hoped, by the terms he would make, to bring not a few hearts back to their king, but he came too late. The king's troops did not think much of the rank that was borne by our men, who, they felt, had no right to put on the airs they did and call themselves grand names. In a few days, Lord Howe sent one of his men on shore with a flag of truce to seek speech with Washington. The man's name was Brown. His boat was met halfway by a barge, which had on board one of our troops named Reed, to whom Brown said he had a note for Mr. Washington. Reed said he knew no man of that name. Brown held out to him the note he had in his hand, which bore on its face George Washington, Esquire. Reed said that he could not take the note. He knew what was due to his chief, so there was naught for Brown to do but to take to his oars. He had not gone far when he came back to ask, "What style shall be used to please Here he caught himself and said, "Mr. Washington." Reed told him that Washington's rank was well known, and Lord Howe could be at no loss as to the right style. In a day or two, the aide-de-camp came with a flag from Lord Howe, and asked if Colonel Patterson might have speech with General Washington. Reed, who met the aide, was prompt to grant this, and pledged himself that no harm should come to him who came in the king's name. So the next day Patterson came, and when he stood face to face with Washington, bowed and said, "Your Excellency." Washington met him with such form and state. He was not a vain man, but was proud of the rank he held, and thought that no man, were he a king, had a right to look down on America, or show the least slight to her commander-in-chief. When he came to hear the terms on which Lord Howe sought to make peace, he found they were not such as he could take. So the war went on. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 10. In and near New York. The Redcoats had a camp on Staten Island, and for the next month or so, ships of war came that far up the bay and brought with them a large force of troops. Northeast of them was the long stretch of land known as Long Island, where they could land their troops with ease and make their way to New York. Washington knew that he could not keep them back, but he meant to vex them all he could. General Greene was placed with a large force on Brooklyn Heights to guard the shore, and troops were sent a mile back to throw up earthworks to check the march of the foe if they should try to come up on the land side. At midnight of August 21st, a spy brought word that the king's troops were on the move and would soon show their strength and put all to the sword. The next day the sound of great guns was heard, and a cloud of smoke was seen to rise from the groves on the south side of Long Island. Word soon came to New York that the king's troops were at Gravesend, and that our troops had fled and set fire to stacks of wheat to keep them out of the hands of the foe. Washington at once sent off a large force to check the foe at Brooklyn, and to lend aid to those in the fort on the heights. He told them to be cool but firm, not to fire when the foe were a long way off, but to wait till they were so near that each shot would tell. And if one of them should skulk, or lie down, or leave his place in the ranks, he was to be shot down at once. Sir Henry Clinton led the king's troops, and Lord Cornwallis had charge of the field guns. Cornwallis made haste to seize a pass that ran through the hills, but found Colonel Hand there with a fine lot of marksmen, and so made a halt at Flatbush. This was so near New York that great fright spread through the town. Those who had the means left the place. There was good cause for fear, as it had been told that if our troops had to leave New York, it would at once be set on fire. This was false, but they did not know it. Their hearts were full of dread. General Putnam was sent to take the place of General Greene, who was sick in bed. The brave man was glad when he had leave to go, for he did not want to be kept in New York when there was a chance to fight for the land he loved. It was 9 o'clock on the night of October 26th that Sir Henry Clinton set out with his vanguard on his march from Flatbush. Lord Cornwallis brought up the rear guard with all the large guns, and the large force of troops led by General Howe. Not a drum was heard, nor the sound of a trump, as they took their course through byroads and on causeways till they came near the pass through the Bedford Hills, where they made a halt. No guard had been put on the road or the pass by General Greene, who must have thought it too far out of the way to need such care. Clinton was quick to see this, and at the first break of day his troops were on the heights and within 3 miles of Bedford. In the meantime, scouts had brought word to our lines that the foe were in force on the right, and Putnam at once sent out troops to hold them in check. At daylight, small fights took place here and there. A brisk fire was kept up at Flatbush. Now was heard the big boom of a large field piece. Then a ship of war would send forth a broadside on the fort at Red Hook. Washington was still in doubt if this was part of the main fight in which New York was to share. 5 ships of the line tried to beat up the bay, but were kept back by a strong headwind. As the day wore on, and there were no signs that the redcoats meant to strike New York, Washington went to Brooklyn in his barge and rode with all speed to the heights. He was just in time to see the fight in the woods, which he could do naught to stay. He stood on a hill, and through his large spyglass had a view of the whole field. He saw his men cut their way through a host of foes. He saw them caught in traps and hemmed in so that they were twixt 2 fires. The whole pass was a scene of blood, and through it rang the clash of arms, the tramp of steeds, the storm of shot, and the cries of men who fought for their lives. On this side and that, our troops were swept down or put to rout by a force they had not the strength to meet. Washington wrung his hands at the sight. "Good God," he cried, "what brave men I must this day lose." The redcoats went into camp that night in front of our lines, but out of reach of the guns of the fort. Our loss was 3,000. Theirs, less than 400. The next day, New York Bay and the small isles were wrapped in a dense fog, from which New York was quite free. Here was a chance for the troops to leave the works on the heights and make their way to New York. Fresh troops were sent down from Fort Washington and King's Bridge, and Washington felt that no time should be lost. His fear was that the King's ships would come up the bay at the turn of the tide, sail up the East River, and catch in a trap all our troops that were on Long Island. It was late at night when the troops stole out from the breastworks. In the dead of night, a big gun went off with a great roar that gave a shock to the nerves of those who were in dread that the least sound might warn the foe of their flight to the New York side. But no harm came of it. The fog shut out the view, and by daybreak our troops had all left the fort and were safe on the New York side. Washington, who had not slept for 2 days and nights and had spent most of the time on horseback, would not step into the boat till he saw all his troops were on board. The fog rose as the rear boats were in midstream, and when the redcoats climbed the crest of the earthworks, they found not a sign of life there, and not a thing they could use. Our men had made a clean sweep, and were proud of the way in which they stole a march on the redcoats. Still, New York was not safe, and Washington sought in all ways to find out the plans of the foe. Ships of war went up the Sound and up the Hudson, and guns were fired on the forts that lay on each side of the town. But he knew that if the redcoats took New York, they would soon be made to give it up. And so he made up his mind that his best course was to withdraw his troops to Harlem Heights. This was done with the loss of a few men who had a fight with some redcoats on the way. And there he stayed a few days and spent much time on horseback. He took note of the land and chose sites for forts and breastworks, and on October 23rd took his stand at White Plains, where a strong fort was built. Soon the din of war was heard. The guns from Fort Washington and Fort Lee poured their fire on the men of war, but could not keep them back, and the redcoats still gave chase to our troops. Fort Washington fell into the hands of the foe in spite of a strong fight made to hold it. One day Washington went out with some of his staff to look at a height at the north where it was thought he might make a stand, and leave the camp where he then was. One of them said, "This is the ground where we ought to be." "Let us go then and view it," said Washington. They were on their way to the place when a horseman rode up in haste and cried out, "The redcoats are in camp, sir." "Then," said Washington, "We have something else to do than this," and at once put spurs to his horse and set off for the camp at full speed. When he reached there, he found all his troops drawn up to meet the foe that was close at hand. In his calm way, he turned to those who had been out with him on the hills and said, "Go back to your post and do the best you can." A short, sharp fight took place, in which our troops made a brave stand, but the redcoats were too strong for them and drove them back to the camp and seized the hill on which they had stood. That night, the troops of Washington and Howe lay not far apart. Washington kept his men at work, and forts were built and earthworks thrown up. These works were made of the stalks of corn or maize, which the men took from a field near at hand. The roots of the stalks, with the earth on them, were placed on the face of the works, in the same way that sods of grass and logs of wood were used. The tops were turned in, and loose earth was thrown on them so that they were held in place and made a good shield from the fire of small arms. The next day, when Howe saw how much had been done by our troops to add to their strength, he made a change in his plans. His own men were in a sad plight, and not fit to cope with the well-fed troops that kept them at bay. The nights were cold, the fall rain set in, and not a few of the redcoats were ill. Their chiefs knew how to fight in straight lines, but were not so shrewd and so quick to make use of what lay at hand as our chiefs were. So he broke up his camp, and in a few days the whole force of redcoats fell back from White Plains. But the strife was kept up at the north, and the foes were at work on sea and on land from New York to Albany. Our troops met with ill luck, and Washington was filled with grief. Fort Washington was in the hands of the foe. Fort Lee was of no use, and the next move of the redcoats was to cross the Hudson north of Fort Lee and to make their way through New Jersey. By that means, they could shut in all our troops twixt the Hudson and the Hackensack. Washington at once sent off his men to save the bridge at Hackensack. No time was to be lost. They left the camp with all haste, but ere they could reach the Hackensack, the vanguard of the foe was close at their heels. It was thought that a fight would take place, but Cornwallis turned back, and some of his troops slept that night in the tents that our men had left. These were dark days. Washington led his troops through New Jersey, hard pressed by Cornwallis, whose vanguard came into Newark just as Washington's rear guard had left it. His whole camp were in flight. He stayed a few days at Brunswick, in hopes that fresh troops would be sent to his aid, but none came. Though his needs were so great, the men who, as he thought, would seize their guns and join his ranks fled from their homes and sought a safe place as soon as they heard that the redcoats were near. On December 2nd, Washington was at Trenton, where he made but a brief halt. Then he crossed the Delaware and left New Jersey in the hands of the foe. If he and his men once got to Philadelphia, they would find troops there with whose aid they might hope to turn back the redcoats so close on their track. General Lee, who was at the heels of the foe, was at Morristown December 11th, where his troops had been forced to halt for 2 days for want of shoes. He was a man who loved his ease and to lie late in bed. One day, as he sat at a desk with pen in hand, one of his aides named Wilkinson, who was with him, looked down the lane that led from the house to the main road and saw a band of redcoats on horseback. He cried out to Lee, "Here are the redcoats." "Where?" said Lee. "Round the house." "Where's the guard?" said Lee with an oath. "Where is the guard? Why don't they fire?" The guards had not thought it worth while to keep watch, when his chief was so much at his ease, so they had stacked their arms and sat down on the south side of the house to sun themselves. As the horsemen came up, they gave chase to the guards, who fled for their lives, and left Lee and his aide to do the best that they could. The redcoats drew near the house where Lee was, and swore that they would set fire to it if the general showed fight. So he was forced to yield, and was brought out in great haste, for they wished to make sure of their prize, and placed on Wilkinson's horse, which stood at the door. He was but half dressed, had no hat on his head, and wore low shoes, and a loose rough coat. In this style he had to ride to New Brunswick, where the king's troops, at sight of him, set off their big guns, for their joy was great. The loss of Lee was thought at the time to be a great blow to our cause, as it was hoped that he would do much to bring the war to an end and to lead the troops out of their sore straits. In the meantime, Washington was on his way to cross the Delaware. There was snow on the ground, and much of the troops could be traced by the blood spots from the feet of those whose shoes were worn out. The redcoats were in force at Trenton, in charge of a man named Raleigh, who had done brave work for King George at White Plains and Fort Washington. Washington's plan was to add to his force, and as soon as he could, cross the Delaware and strive to wrest Trenton from the hands of the foe. He and his force were to cross the stream 9 miles north of the town. General Ewing was to cross with his troops a mile south of the town, and General Putnam to leave at a point south of Burlington. It was a bold scheme, full of risk to all who took part in it. Yet there was naught to be done but to push on and hope for the best. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 11. A Sad Year. Christmas night was the time set to cross the Delaware, and at sunset the troops were on the move. It was a dark, cold night. The wind was high, the tide strong, and the stream full of cakes of ice which drove the boats out of their course. It seemed at times as if the boats would be crushed to bits. Men who were used to boats and had been brought up on the sea and fought with fierce storms and wild gales found it hard work, with all their skill, to make their way from shore to shore. Washington, who crossed with the troops, stood on the east bank till all the field guns were brought to land, and it was 4 o'clock ere the men took up their line of march. Trenton was 9 miles off, and they could not reach there till daylight, too late to take the king's troop off their guard. Most of the troops at Trenton were Hessians from Hesse, a small German state whose prince had lent his troops to King George for hire. As I have told you, they were in charge of Raleigh. Raleigh thought more of his brass band than he did of his men, was full of good cheer and liked to have a good time. He would sit up till a late hour in the night and then lie in bed till 9 o'clock the next day. The one who leads troops to war should be like a watchdog, quick to see and to hear all that goes on, and to be on guard at all times. Each day he had the guns drawn out and dragged through the town, just to make a stir and have the band out. But when the major told him that he should have earthworks thrown up on which to place the guns, he said, "Pooh-pooh, let the foe come on. We'll charge on them with the bayonet." "But, Herr Colonel," said the old major, "it costs not much, and if it does not help, it will not harm." But Raleigh laughed, as if he thought it a good joke, turned on his heel and went off, and the works were not thrown up. On this night, too, there was a great stir in the camp at Trenton, for the men did their best to keep Christmas, and their thoughts were of home and the dear ones there. They made what cheer they could, and did not dream that the foe was so near. A storm of hail and snow set in as soon as our troops took up their march. They could scarce see their way through the sleet they had to face. The night was so cold that 2 of the men froze to death. At dawn of day, some of the men came to a halt at a crossroad, where they did their best to dry their guns. But some were past use, and word was sent to Washington of the state of their arms. They were in doubt what to do. Washington, in a burst of rage, bade the men to go back to his chief at once and tell him to push on and charge if he could not fire. At 8 o'clock, Washington drew near the town at the head of his troops. He went up to a man who had come out to chop wood by the roadside and asked him where the guard was who stood out. At 8 o'clock, Washington drew near the town at the head of his troops. He went up to a man who had come out to chop wood by the roadside and asked him where the guard was who stood at the outpost of Raleigh's camp. The man said in a harsh voice, "I don't know." "You may tell him," said one of our men who stood near, "for that is General Washington." At once a great change came o'er the man to whom Washington spoke. He raised his hands and cried, "God bless you, God bless you," and then showed where the guards could be found. Soon was heard the cry from Rall's men, "The foe! The foe! Turn out! Turn out!" Drums beat to arms. The whole place was in a stir. Washington came in on the north, Sullivan on the west, and Stark at the south end of the town. Rall scarce knew how to act. He rode to the front of his troops and got them out of the town. Then he seemed to feel that it was a shame to fly in that way, for he was a brave man. So he led his men back in a wild dash out of the woods and into the town to meet the foe. In the midst of the fight, a shot struck him, and he fell from his horse. The troops would heed no voice but that of their chief, and fled up the banks of a creek on the way to Princeton. Washington saw the stir and thought they had wheeled to form a new line. He was told that they had laid down their arms, and his joy was great. The day was ours. But for the wild flight of Rall's men, it would have gone hard with our troops. Washington did not know it at the time, but he found out that Ewing and Putnam had tried to cross the stream, but were kept back by the ice. And he with his raw troops would, he was sure, have been put to rout had Rall and his men been on their guard. The poor major, who had in vain urged Rall to throw up breastworks, had a bad wound of which he died in Trenton, and Rall himself, to whom the redcoats owed their ill luck, was laid to rest in a graveyard in that town. And where was General Howe all this time? In New York, where he thought to take his ease till the Delaware froze so that his troops could cross. He was much shocked at the news that the Hessians, who had been brought up to war, should have laid down their arms for a troop of raw men in rags. He sent Lord Cornwallis back to take Jersey, and as he said, to bag the fox. By the 3rd of January, redcoats, with Cornwallis at their head, were near at hand. Washington was in a tight place, with a small creek twixt his few raw troops and the large force of the foe. Back of him lay the Delaware, which it was now not safe to cross. In this dark hour a gleam of hope came to his mind. He saw a way out of the trap, and that was by a quick night march to get at the rear of the king's troops, dash on the camp at Princeton, seize the stores that were left there, and push on to New Brunswick. A thaw had set in which made the roads deep with mire, but in the course of the night the wind veered to the north, and in 2 hours the roads were once more hard and frost-bound. That the foe might not guess his plan, Washington bade some of his men to keep at work with their spades on their pits near the bridge, go the rounds, change guards at each bridge and ford, and keep up campfires till daybreak, when they were to join those on the way to Princeton. In the dead of night, Washington drew his troops out of camp, and the march took place. The road which they had to take was cut through woods, and the stumps of trees made the march a slow one, so that it was near sunrise when Washington came to the bridge at the brook 3 miles from Princeton. As our troops left the woods, they came face to face with a force of redcoats, and a sharp fight took place, which did not last long. Washington was in the midst of it. In the heat of the fight, his aide-de-camp lost sight of him in the dusk and smoke. The young man dropped the reins on the neck of his horse, drew down his cap to hide the tears in his eyes, and gave him up for lost. When he saw Washington come out of the cloud with his hat raised and the foe in flight, he spurred up to his side. "Thank God you are safe," cried he. "Away, and bring up the troops," said Washington. "The day is our own." At daybreak, when General Howe thought to bag his fox, he found the prize had slipped from his grasp, and soon learned that the king's troops had lost their hold on New Jersey. The fame of Washington and of the brave deeds of those who fought to be free went across the sea and made friends for him and the cause. Not a few came to their aid. One of these brave souls was a Pole, whose name was Kosciuszko. The commander-in-chief said to him, "What do you seek here?" "To fight for the cause you have at heart." "What can you do?" "Try me." This style of speech and the air of the man pleased Washington so well that he at once made him an aide-de-camp. This was in 1777. He served the cause well and went back to his own land in 1786 with the rank of brigadier general. In 1777, Lafayette came from France to join the troops led by Washington. He had wealth and high rank in his own land, and had lived but a score of years. He left his young wife and the gay court of France and made his way to America to do what he could to aid the foes of King George. He came, he said, to learn and not to teach, and would serve without pay, and as one who came of his own free will. He soon won his way to the heart of Washington, and a strong bond of love grew up twixt the two, which naught but death could break. In the meantime, the whole of our land south of the Great Lakes was a scene of strife and bloodshed, and it was hard work for our troops to keep the Redskins and Redcoats at bay. I have not space to tell you of all the fights that took place, nor the ways in which Washington sought to vex the king's troops. On the 3rd of October of this year, 1777, we find him at Germantown, where the main force of the Redcoats were in camp. His plan was to drive them out, but though his troops fought with much skill, and in the midst of a dense fog, they were forced back, and the day was lost. The ships of war in the Delaware led Washington to think that Lord Howe meant to turn his guns on Philadelphia, and his mind was filled with doubts and fears. In the same month, word came to him that Burgoyne, who was at the head of the king's troops in the north, had been forced to yield to General Gates at Fishkill. This was such a blow to the king's cause that the troops at West Point and elsewhere on the Hudson, who were to have gone to the aid of Burgoyne, left the forts and made their way to New York. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 12. Foes in the Camp. It is much worse to have one foe in the camp than to have a host of foes outside. For who can tell what harm he may do who comes in the guise of a friend? In the year 1774, a young man named John Andre came with the king's troops and fought in their ranks at St. John's and Crown Point. He had a brave heart and a fine mind, and did much to keep up the hearts of the men when in the camp. He was fond of the fair sex, and had praised in rhyme the charms of a Miss Shippen, who wed Benedict Arnold in the year 1780. Arnold had fought well on our side at the north, and won much praise. He had been a seaman in his youth, and was both strong and brave, but he grew proud and vain, and sought to rank as high as the commander-in-chief, with whom he found much fault. Washington had great faith in him, and did not dream he was false at heart. For some ill deeds while at Philadelphia, Arnold had been brought to court and tried, and his guilt proved, and this had made him wroth with Washington, and the cause he had sworn to aid. He sought for a way to pay back the slight and raise himself to fame. With this end in view, he wrote to Sir Henry Clinton, but did not use his own name, that he would like to join the cause of King George on the terms that he had set forth. He was in need of funds, for he was deep in debt, but Clinton did not see fit to make use of him. 2 or 3 more of his schemes failed, and at last he asked that he might have charge of the post at West Point. This Washington gave him, and in August Arnold fixed himself in a fine house that stood on the east side of the stream, half a mile or so south of West Point. From this place he sent notes to Andre, the aide-de-camp of Clinton, who wrote back and signed his name John Anderson. Arnold's plan was to throw West Point and the Highlands into the hands of Sir Henry Clinton at the time that Washington was at King's Bridge, and the English troops in New York. A fleet with a large land force on board was to come up to the Highlands, and Arnold would at once yield up the post into their hands. This act, he thought, would bring the war to an end. With the flag of King George at high mast, and then great would be the name and fame of Benedict Arnold. That the scheme might not fail, Arnold wrote to Andre to meet him at Dobbs Ferry, September 11th at noon. But Arnold had spent the night of the 10th at Harvestraw on the west shore, and on his way back in his barge As he had no flag, he was fired on by the guard boats of the king's troops, so he had to put off his plans for a day or two. In the meantime, the sloop of war Vulture, a good name for such a bird of prey, was brought up the Hudson so as to be near at hand to aid in the vile scheme. On September 18th, Washington, with his suite, crossed the Hudson at Vanderplank's Point in Arnold's barge on his way to Hartford. Arnold went with him as far as Peekskill and talked with him in a frank way, as if he were most true to the cause. Andre went up the Hudson on the 20th and went on board the Vulture, where he thought to meet Arnold. But Arnold knew it would not be safe for him to be there, so he kept in the background. The next night, a boat crept up to the side of the Vulture, in which were two men. Their oars scarce made a sound. Andre, who wore a blue greatcoat, went on board this boat and was rowed to the west side of the stream. 6 miles south of Stony Point, they came to a shore at the foot of a high mount known as Long Clove. It was midnight. Dark was the hour, and dark the place, and dark the deed. Arnold was there, hid in the shade of the woods. A man was near who came to wait on him and take care of his horse. He and Andre had a long talk. 1, 2, 3 hours passed, and still there was more to say. One of the men who had brought Andre, and whose name was Smith, warned them that it was near daybreak, and the boat would be seen by our guards if they did not go back soon. Arnold feared that the sight of a boat on its way to the Vulture might bring harm to him and his scheme, so he urged Andre to stay on shore till the next night. The boat was sent to a creek up the Hudson, and Andre, on the horse that Arnold's man had rode, set off with Arnold for Smith's house. The road took them through the small town of Haverstraw. As they rode on in the dark, the voice of one of the guards at an outpost made Andre start, for he knew he must be within our lines. But it was too late to turn back, and at daybreak they reached Smith's house. Scarce was the door closed on them when the boom of great guns was heard from down the stream. Andre felt ill at ease and had good cause for fear. The fact was that as soon as Livingston, who had charge of our troops at Vanderplank's Point, heard that the Vulture was within shot of Teller's Point, which juts out twixt Havershaw Bay and Tappan Sea, he sent some men and some big guns to that point in the night to fire on the sloop of war. Andre kept a close watch on the scene from a top room in Smith's house. At one time he thought the Vulture was on fire, but his heart gave a throb of joy when he saw the sloop of war drop down the stream out of reach of gunshot. Arnold gave Andre the plans of the works at West Point and told him what and how he was to do. As the Vulture had changed her place, he told Andre it would be far more safe for him to go back to New York by land, and he would reach there in less time. But Andre said that he must be put on board the sloop of war the next night, and in case he should change his mind, Arnold gave him a pass that he might go by sea or by land. At 10 o'clock that morn, Arnold left him to his fate. Time moved at a slow pace with poor Andre. Once on board the Vulture, he would be safe. His task would be done, and West Point would soon be in the hands of the redcoats. As night set in, he grew still more ill at ease, and asked Smith how he had planned to get him on board the Vulture. It gave him a shock to learn that Smith had not done the least thing. The boatmen had gone home, and he would not take him on board the Vulture, but he said he would cross the Hudson with him and start him on the road to New York by land, and go some of the way with him on horseback. They set off at sunset, and went for 8 miles on the road to White Plains, when they were brought to a halt by a band of our troops, who were out as watchmen. Andre showed his pass signed with Arnold's name, and so they took him for a friend and not a foe. He wore a coat of Smith's that made him look like a plain man. The two were warned that it was not safe for them to be on the road at night, as they might meet the cowboys from the king's troops, who but a short time since had swept through that part of the land. Smith was full of fears, and Andre had to yield to his wish to take a bed in a farmhouse near at hand. This they did, but Andre could not sleep. He knew that he was not safe. At daybreak he woke Smith and made him haste to leave the place. 2.5 miles from Pines Bridge on the Croton River, Andre and Smith took a scant meal at a farmhouse which had been stripped by the cowboys. Here Smith took leave of Andre, who was to go the rest of the way to New York alone. He felt no fear now, as he had passed our lines and was clear of those who kept watch on the outposts. 6 miles from Pines Bridge he came to a fork in the road. The left branch led to White Plains. The right branch led to the Hudson. He had thought at first that he would take the left-hand road, as the right one was said to be filled with cowboys. But he had naught to fear from them, as he was on their side. And as it was a more straight road to New York, he turned down it and took his course on the banks of the Hudson. He had not gone far when he came to a place where a small stream crossed the road and ran down a dell that was thick with trees. A man stepped out with a gun and brought Andre to a stand. 2 armed men came up to aid the first one, whose name was Paulding. Paulding's coat was in rags, and was of the kind that was worn by the king's troops. When Andre caught sight of it, his heart leapt for joy, for he was sure he was safe, so sure that he did not guard his tongue. He asked the men if they were on his side, and they said they were. He then told who he was, and that he had been sent to a post up the Hudson and was in haste to get back. As he spoke, he drew out a gold watch, such as few owned in those days, and none but men of wealth. Think what a shock it must have been to Andre when Paulding said they were not his friends but his foes, and he was in their hands. Then Andre tried to make out what he first told was a lie, but that he would now tell the truth, and he drew forth his pass to prove that he was all right. Had he done this in the first place, he might have gone on his way. A still tongue shows a wise head. The men seized his horse by the rein and told Andre to get off. He warned them that he had been sent out by General Arnold, and that they would be ill dealt with if they held him back. "We care not for that," they said, as they led him through the shrubs on the edge of the brook. Then they went to work to search him, and took note of the way in which he was dressed. They were poor men, and had not had a chance to see such fine clothes. Andre wore a round hat, a blue greatcoat, neath which was a red coat decked off with gold lace, a nankeen vest, small clothes, and boots. They made him take off his coat and vest, and found naught to prove that he had sought to harm their cause, and they had a mind to let him go. Paulding, who had been twice in the hands of the redcoats and ill-used by them, was still not quite free from doubt. A thought came to his mind. "Boys," said he, "his boots must come off." At this Andre's face flushed, and he said that his boots were hard to get off, and he begged that he might not lose time in this way. But the men were firm. They made him sit down. His boots were drawn off, and the plans that Arnold gave him were brought to light. Paulding looked at them and cried out, "He is a spy!" He then asked Andre where he had got these plans. "From a man at Pine Bridge," he said, "a man whom I did not know." As he put on his clothes, Andre begged the men to let him go. He would pay them a large sum and stay with 2 of the men while one went to New York to get it. Here Paulding broke in. "Keep your gold. We want none of it. Were it 10 times as much, you should not stir one step." Andre had to yield to his fate, and was led by the men to our post, which was 10 or 12 miles off. Andre rode on horseback with 1 man in front and 1 at each side. At noon they came to a farmhouse, and those who dwelt there sat at the midday meal. The housewife, whose heart was touched by a sight of Andre's youth and look of grief, asked him to draw near and take some of the food. Then, as she caught sight of his gold-laced coat, the good dame said that she knew it was poor fare for such as he, but it was the best she had. Poor Andre shook his head and said, "Oh, it is all good, but indeed I cannot eat." When the 4 reached the outpost and Jameson, who was in charge, saw the plans that had been found on Andre, he at once saw that they had been drawn up by the hand of Benedict Arnold. He at once did the thing he ought not to have done, which was to write to Arnold and tell him that a man who said his name was John Anderson had been caught and held, though he bore a pass signed by him. The plans found on him had been sent to the commander-in-chief, and Andre, with a strong guard, was sent with a note to Arnold. In a short time, Major Talmadge, who was the next in rank to Jameson, came back from a trip to White Plains. He had a clear head, and as soon as he heard the case, he at once urged Jameson to send a man in haste to bring Andre back. This was done, but Jameson had not thought to have a note to Arnold brought back, so it sped on to let the knave know that his plot had failed. As soon as Arnold read the note, he sprang on the horse of the man who brought it, and rode with all speed to the dock where his six-oared barge lay moored. He threw himself into it and bade his men pull out in midstream and row as fast as they could to Teller's Point, as he must be back in time to meet Washington, who was then on his way to West Point. The guards knew his barge, so they did not fire on it, and a bit of white cloth waved in the air served as a flag of truce. He soon was on board the Vulture, where he gave himself up, and the coxswain and 6 bargemen with him. This was a mean act, and showed just what kind of man Arnold was. But as soon as the men made it known that they had been led to think that all was all right, and that a flag of truce gave them a safe pass, they were at once set free. Arnold gave the redcoats much aid, and they were glad to make use of him, but they did not care to make friends with so base a man. At the close of the war, he went to England, and made his home there. He was shunned by all, and died in the year 1801 at the age of 60. As Washington drew near the fort at West Point, he thought it strange that no guns were fired. "Is not General Arnold here?" he asked one of the men who came down to the shore to meet him. "No, sir. He has not been here for 2 days past, nor have I heard from him in that time." This was strange, but soon the note from Jameson was placed in his hands. When he had read of the deep-laid scheme, he said with a deep sigh, "Whom can we trust now?" Word was at once sent out to the guards to check Arnold's flight, but it was too late. He had slipped from their grasp. Let us now see how Andre bore his hard fate. He had the best of care, and made hosts of friends, who grieved that one so young, so well bred, and of such high rank should have done a crime for which he must be hung. It was a great grief to Washington, who would have felt no pang had Arnold been in Andre's place. But death to the spy was one of the rules of war, and on October 2nd was the day set for Andre to be hung. He had asked that since it was his lot to die, he might choose the mode of death, and he begged that he might be shot. This Washington could not grant, though in his heart he longed to do so, but thought it best that Andre should not know. On the morn of the 2nd, Andre dressed himself with great care, in the full suit worn by those who bore his rank in the king's troops. He was calm, while all those near him were in tears. He walked with a firm step to the place where he was to end his life, arm in arm with 2 of our troops. When he caught sight of the rope, he gave a start, and asked if he was not to be shot. When told that no change could be made, he said, "How hard is my fate, but it will be but a brief pang." Then he stepped into the cart, took off his hat and stock, loosed his shirt at the throat, put the noose round his neck, and bound his own eyes. When told that there was a chance for him to speak if he chose, he said, "I pray you to note that I meet my fate like a brave man." Then the cart was moved off, and he was left in midair, and death took place in a short time. Andre was laid in a grave near the place where he was hung, but in 1821 was borne to the land of his birth, and placed near the tombs of kings and queens. He that breaks laws must pay the price. If you want to make friends, and to have them love and trust you, be true. Let no one coax you to sin. The eye of God is on you, and he sees all your deeds. You may hide your crime for a while, but you may be sure your sin will find you out. Be not an Arnold, nor an Andre. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 13. The Hardships of War. We will now go back to the place we left and see where Washington was at the close of the year 1777. He had been forced to leave New Jersey in the hands of the king's troops. His own troops were worn down by long and hard toil and had need of rest. They were in want of clothes, too, and could not keep warm in the tents, so he sought out a place where they could build huts and screen themselves from the cold winds and storms. He chose Valley Forge, which was on the west bank of the Schuylkill River, and a score of miles from Philadelphia. Sad was the march of the troops to Valley Forge. Food was scant, their clothes were worn out, and a track of blood marked the way they trod. They had fought hard, but did not win, and this made their hearts low. On December 17th, they reached Valley Forge and had to freeze in their tents till they could cut down the trees and build the huts they were to live in. The walls were 6.5 feet high and were made of logs filled in with clay. The roofs were made of logs split in half. No pen can paint the hard lot of those poor men shut in at Valley Forge. For some days they had no meat. For 3 days they had no bread. Some of the men had to sit up all night by the fires, as there were no clothes for their beds, and they could not sleep for the cold. Some of the men were so scant of clothes that they could not leave their huts. Washington was kept short of funds and of troops, though he pled hard for both, and was sore pressed on all sides. He scarce knew what to do. There was but one thing he could do, and that was to wait. While his troops were in this sad plight, some of them sick unto death, the redcoats who held Philadelphia in siege led a gay sort of life, and were much at their ease. Near the 1st of March, a German came to Washington's camp to lend him his aid. His name was Baron Steuben. He had fought for long years in the wars that had been waged in Europe, and had been aide-de-camp to Frederick the Great, and had won much fame by his brave deeds. The French, who were friends to our cause, knew that we had need of such a man as Baron Steuben, and urged him to come to America, and he was at once sent to join the troops at Valley Forge. Our troops had had no chance to drill. There was no one to teach them, and they had fought with a rush and a dash, and in a pell-mell sort of way. Steuben went to work to drill these men, the best of whom had much to learn.